We have with us Professor Richard Falk, Professor Emeritus of International Law at Princeton University and former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Falk.
It's my pleasure.
So, Dr. Falk, the Palestinian dream of having an independent state remains unrealized as they mark the 74th anniversary of their homeland's partition by the United Nations. What are your thoughts on this occasion?
Well, my primary thought is the tragedy that has been imposed on the Palestinian people over this long period of time, where they have suffered a very harsh and oppressive regime of control that has denied them the realization of their most basic rights, and above all, the right of self-determination. And going back even further than the partition resolution of 1947, the Zionist project committed an initial wrong when it embarked on establishing an exclusive Jewish state in a non-Jewish society. And it did this by immigration and by geopolitics and subsidizing the movement of Jews from around the world to Palestine. This was a classic example of settler colonialism at the very time historically when colonialism was discredited and collapsing around the world. This in turn required Israel as a state concerned with its security to deal with resistance that was part of the national identity of the Palestinian people. And they had a right of resistance, especially to a colonial encroachment on their territory. And the Israeli reaction to that was to establish not only a discriminatory and dominating structure of control, but one that was racist in its essential character, having a Jewish elite control a non-Jewish population. And this is what's led people around the world to increasingly view Palestinian subjugation as one of an apartheid structure that resembles what was eventually dismantled in South Africa after a long struggle there.
In 2017, you actually co-authored with Professor Virginia Tilley the report and said that Israel had established an apartheid regime that dominates the Palestinian people as a whole. And this was the first time a report from a UN body made that conclusion. Now, in this past year or so, two other organizations, Human Rights Watch and Bet Shalom, have also called Israel a apartheid state. Have you read those reports, and what do you think of those reports?
Well, I think that there's been an amazing shift in the understanding of the Palestinian victimization and the Israeli mode of rule. Our study in 2017 was, as you say, the first serious academic study that tried to examine the evidence and the law that pertain to this allegation of apartheid. Previously, apartheid had entered somewhat the pro-Palestinian movement, but at its fringes and more radical elements. What has happened in the last 5 years, initially a consequence of our report that was attacked at the UN by the United States and Israel, was these two other reports, one by an Israeli NGO and the other by a mainstream American NGO that was somewhat identified with liberal Zionism. These, the effect has been to make the understanding of the apartheid nature of the Israeli state a matter of mainstream understanding. The the rhetoric has changed, and one should further grasp the significance of the fact that apartheid is a crime against humanity in the Rome Statute that governs the International Criminal Court. So this is a major development in what I call the legitimacy war that is often decisive in these struggles for self-determination. It's not what happens on the battlefield that has won the anti-colonial wars of the prior century. It is really what happens in this symbolic domain of legitimacy. And there the UN plays an important role. And I think the kind of civil society studies that you referred to reinforce that role and give the Palestinians a solid foundation for their struggle and to address the grievances. And it's been a failure of the international community that it has been unable to produce a solution that was sustainable and gave was sustainable and implemented the basic rights of the Palestinian people.
Now, yesterday, Mohammed al-Kurdi, the young Palestinian activist, he gave a speech at the United Nations. He asked, how long will we offer Israel impunity? And he believes that one day this the settler colonial project that Israel has imposed on the Palestinians will come to an end, and this occupation will come to an end. But he asks, when will the United States be on the right side of history?
That's a very important but almost impossible question to answer, because it depends on how the play of forces within the United States address this moral and legal challenge. We do see some glimmers of hope in the sense that Congress has some few members now that are willing to take a somewhat balanced position, and the idea of a bipartisan consensus that has no dissent is something that has been put aside. Also, the Biden presidency, while following the basic pro-Israeli line, has not done so in such a defiant and irresponsible way that was true of the Trump presidency, which lasted between 2017 and 2021.
So what is next for the Palestinians? Are there, as an expert in international law, I'd really like for you to comment. What do you see? What courts can they use? What else is in store for them?
Well, you first have to understand that international law by itself cannot solve this problem because the geopolitical resistance to implementing international law in this case is so powerful that it has up to this point nullified what should have been long ago done. And so I've often pointed out that the primacy of geopolitics prevents, in contexts of this sort, the implementation of international law. At the same time, international law can mobilize public opinion and civil society activism in ways that can affect the geopolitical pressure. And that happened in relation to South Africa, which no one thought would voluntarily or without violence, without substantial violence, make a transition to a multiracial constitutional democracy. So my view is that one should use the avenues of international law that are available. One of the main ones is the International Criminal Court, which has shown some willingness to investigate alleged crimes of Israel in the course of its occupation since 2014 at least. And there's every reason to think that a responsible International Criminal Court prosecutor would investigate the allegations of apartheid that now have received such substantial support in international society. There's also the possibility in some countries of using national courts, what is called universal jurisdiction, to impose criminal accountability on Israeli officials that are present within their territorial domain. That's probably not a very important procedure in this context because Israelis have stayed away from countries that have such universal jurisdiction procedures available. So my end point is to say that international law is important in the legitimacy war context, but it cannot challenge a commitment that has geopolitical capabilities without very strong popular mobilization in civil society transnationally. That's what happened in relation to South African apartheid, and that brought an end to that system of racial domination, which no one expected, and which came about because the pressure mobilized was sufficient to change the outlook of the white supremacist leadership that had imposed apartheid on the Black majority population in South Africa. We have to recognize that international institutions have failed to find a solution over this 74-year period. They've been given more than an opportunity, but they have succumbed to the primacy of geopolitics to the exercise of the veto in the Security Council and to the defiant attitude taken by Israel toward international legal obligations. So now the responsibility and the opportunity is largely in the hands of civil society activism. And it is there that I believe hope lies for a just and sustainable peace that will benefit both peoples eventually.
Thank you so much for your insight and your time. A big responsibility on the shoulders of activists and Palestinian diaspora all over the world to keep this this apartheid, keep this occupation centered. So thank you so much for your time.
It's not just Palestinians who have an interest. This is a question that challenges all human beings. And it's a human interest to see that this evil system of apartheid is no longer operative in relation to the Palestinian people. All of us are responsible, including Jews such as myself.